Ohio had always been a place where time seemed to move at its own pace. The gentle hum of cicadas in the summer, the faint sound of a tractor in the distance, and the occasional chatter of neighbors caught up in their daily lives were the soundtrack of rural America. Rolling hills stretched as far as the eye could see, dotted with modest homes, barns, and fields of corn. People knew each other here. Everyone had a story, a history, and a connection to the land. The pace was slow. The days were long, and life had a certain simplicity that most people outside of Ohio could only dream of. But this summer, something felt different. It was subtle at first, a shift in the atmosphere, a heaviness in the air that no one could quite explain. The sun hung lower in the sky, casting a strange orange glow over the town. The air was thick with humidity, but it wasn't just the usual summer heat that made it uncomfortable. There was something else, something almost suffocating. It was as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. John, the local mechanic, was the first to feel it. He wasn't the type of man to believe in omens or signs, but lately he'd been restless. His garage, which had once been his sanctuary, felt like a cage. The tools, the grease-stained workbench, the worn leather chair where he'd spent countless hours fixing cars. It all seemed somehow foreign to him now. He'd been working late, as usual, when the first sound reached his ears. It was faint at first. A low, staccato phrasing, a low, almost imperceptible groan that seemed to come from nowhere. He walked out of the garage, stepping into the warm evening air, straining to listen. The groaning continued, growing louder, more distinct, but still not quite right. It wasn't the sound of an animal, not a coyote or a deer. This was deeper, more guttural. He shook his head, trying to shake off the feeling creeping up his spine. Maybe it was just his mind playing tricks on him. After all, he had been working long hours, the stress of running the garage weighing on him more than usual. But the feeling of unease didn't go away. Instead, it seemed to follow him. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences began to multiply. At first, it was small things. Lights flickering, strange noises in the night, and the odd feeling of being watched. But then, people started disappearing. It wasn't anything that made the evening news. No one had officially declared anything wrong. It was just the quiet absence of neighbors, friends, and even familiar faces in the grocery store. Mrs. Richards, the elderly woman who lived 2 doors down, hadn't been seen for days. No one had heard from her. The local school teacher, Mr. Pierce, was gone without a word. The sheriff, a man who had been known for his level-headedness, was nowhere to be found. It was as though they had all vanished, and no one knew why. As the days passed, the fear began to spread. People became cautious, paranoid. They started locking their doors, even during the day. Neighbors who had once greeted each other with a wave or a nod now crossed the street to avoid one another. Conversations turned to whispers about strange things they'd seen in the woods. People spoke of shadows moving between the trees, of eerie figures at the edge of the forest, and of groaning sounds in the distance. But when anyone went to investigate, there was nothing to be found. No trace of the people who had disappeared. No sign of anything unusual, except for the gnawing feeling in the pit of everyone's stomach that told them something was terribly wrong. John tried to keep his distance from the growing panic. He focused on his work, throwing himself into the cars that came into the garage. The hum of engines a distraction from the unsettling thoughts creeping into his mind. But even he couldn't ignore the strange things happening around him. It wasn't just the people who were disappearing. It was the land itself. The trees in the woods had begun to look sickly, their leaves wilting in a way that was unnatural for the time of year. The animals, once abundant, had become scarce. It wasn't just the quiet that filled the town now. It was the absence of life, a hollow silence that settled over everything. The night air had grown colder, and John found himself locking his door earlier each evening, his ears straining for the sound of the groaning that had begun to haunt his nights. He couldn't tell if it was real or if it was all in his head, but it didn't matter. The fear was palpable, crawling under his skin, making his hair stand on end. And then, one night, it happened. He was in his garage, working late again, when the groaning sound returned, louder, more insistent this time. He froze, his heart racing. This was no animal. This wasn't the wind. There was something out there, something that was calling to him. He grabbed his flashlight, his fingers trembling as he clicked it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but it revealed nothing. He took a deep breath, shaking his head, trying to calm himself. There had to be an explanation. But just as he turned to go back inside, he heard something else. A loud crash, followed by a scream. It came from the direction of the woods, close enough that he could almost feel it in his bones. John's heart pounded in his chest as he bolted from the garage, rushing toward the sound. His mind raced, thoughts tumbling over one another. But one thing was clear. The town of Ohio, the place he had called home his entire life, was no longer the same. As John reached the edge of the woods, the air grew colder, the scent of decay thick in the air. His breath came in sharp, ragged gasps as he scanned the darkness, looking for any sign of what had caused the scream. But there was nothing. Just the wind rustling through the trees, the distant howl of an animal, and the unsettling feeling that someone was watching him. He turned to go back, his instincts telling him to get as far away from the woods as possible. But before he could take another step, the ground beneath him shook. The sound of footsteps, heavy, dragging, like something was being pulled through the dirt, reached his ears. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. A figure, moving slowly but surely, its body stiff and unnatural, its eyes locked on him. It wasn't human. John's blood ran cold as he realized the nightmare had only just begun. What he had been hearing, what he had been dreading, was no longer a distant fear. It was here. And Ohio, his Ohio, was about to become ground zero for the most horrific zombie massacre the world had ever seen. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of deep orange and purple, a peaceful end to an otherwise unsettling day. The air, still thick with humidity from the afternoon's heat, was now cool and heavy, as if the town of Ohio itself was waiting for something to happen. Sarah, a young mother of 2, stood in her small kitchen, washing dishes and humming a lullaby to herself. It had been a long day, and she was looking forward to putting her kids to bed and settling into a quiet evening with her husband, Tom, when he came back from his late shift at the factory. She was wiping her hands on the towel when she heard it. Something faint, almost imperceptible at first. A dragging sound, like a foot scraping against the dirt. At first, Sarah didn't think much of it. She assumed it was Tom returning home after a long day. He often walked the short distance from the factory, leaving his truck at work to get a little exercise after his shifts. But as the minutes ticked by and Tom didn't come through the door, the sound continued, growing louder. Sarah set the dish down, her brow furrowing in confusion. She walked quietly to the window, pushing aside the curtain just enough to peek outside, expecting to see Tom's familiar figure coming down the sidewalk. What she saw made her blood run cold. A group of figures, too many to count, was slowly moving down the street. They shuffled with an unnatural, jerky motion, their limbs stiff and awkward, as if they had forgotten how to walk. Their clothing, once normal, was now tattered and covered in dirt, their skin hanging in sickly patches, almost as if they had been crawling through the ground itself. But what really froze Sarah in place, unable to breathe, was their eyes. Empty, lifeless, and unblinking, they stared at her house with a single-minded intensity. They weren't just wandering, they were coming for her. Her heart began to race, her breath shallow and uneven. She took a step back, trying to pull herself together. This couldn't be happening. It had to be some kind of joke, some strange Halloween prank, or maybe some kids from the neighboring town causing trouble. But something deep inside her told her this was no joke. This was real, terrifyingly real. The figures drew closer, moving down the street like a slow-moving wave of death. Sarah's mind raced, trying to find an explanation, trying to deny the truth that was beginning to settle over her. She looked out into the street again, her eyes scanning the figures as they got closer. She felt her stomach churn, when she noticed that they weren't just wandering aimlessly. They were heading straight for her house. One of them, an older man, lifted his head and made eye contact with her. His face was gaunt, his features twisted in a grotesque expression of hunger, and his mouth hung open, revealing a set of rotting teeth. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she realized the figures weren't just moving. They were focused on her home, on the life inside. And then, without warning, the first one lunged at her front door, its arms flailing in a wild frenzy. The force of the impact shook the house, the door creaking as if it might give way any second. Sarah stumbled backward, her heart pounding in her chest. She froze, unable to move, as the sound of moaning filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. The creatures outside weren't just trying to break down the door. They were demanding entry. They were desperate. Their hunger for whatever they could find was terrifying. But the thing that sent an icy chill down Sarah's spine was the knowledge that she and her children were the ones they were after. She heard the unmistakable sound of the door splintering, the wood cracking under the pressure. They were getting through. Sarah's mind screamed at her to act, but her body refused to respond. In that moment, time seemed to slow, her thoughts a jumble of fear and disbelief. The door shattered with a final, violent crack, and the figures, there were at least 5 or 6 of them now, pushed through the broken remains, their moans growing louder, more frenzied. Sarah's instincts finally kicked in. She screamed her children's names. "Tommy, Ella," she cried, her voice hoarse with terror. Her young son, Tommy, who was barely 5, came running down the hall, his little feet padding against the hardwood floor. Ella, her 2-year-old daughter, was right behind him, clutching her stuffed bunny to her chest. The fear in their eyes mirrored her own, and for a split second, Sarah was paralyzed with guilt. What had she done wrong? Why was this happening to them? She grabbed her children, her hands shaking as she pulled them into her arms. "Down to the basement, now," she ordered, her voice sounding much stronger than she felt. She could hear the creatures inside the house now, their heavy breathing mixed with the sound of their feet scraping against the floor. The house felt smaller, more suffocating as they drew closer. The moans echoed through the walls, filling every corner with a sense of impending doom. She shoved the kids down the stairs, praying they would stay quiet, praying they would stay out of sight. Sarah slammed the basement door shut behind them, the sound of the lock clicking into place almost drowned out by the noise upstairs. The air in the basement was musty, the scent of mildew thick, but Sarah didn't notice. She could hear them upstairs, their heavy footsteps thudding against the floorboards, the sounds of their groans and growls rattling the walls. It was a nightmare. She couldn't understand how something like this was happening, how her small town, so peaceful just a few days ago, had turned into a battleground for the living and the dead. Tommy clung to her side, his small body trembling with fear. Ella was crying, her little face buried in her mother's arms. Sarah rocked them both, trying to soothe them, trying to reassure them that everything would be okay. But deep down, she knew the truth. This was no ordinary attack. This wasn't a home invasion or some random act of violence. These things were something else, something that no one could understand, something that was hungry, not just for food, but for their very lives. Suddenly, the basement door rattled. The sound of fingernails scraping against wood sent a jolt of terror through Sarah. She pressed her children tighter against her, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. She could hear them upstairs, the creatures slowly making their way down. The noises grew louder, closer, and then there was a thud, a heavy weight landing on the top of the basement stairs. They had found them. Sarah's heart raced as she backed into the corner, her eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of an escape. But there was none. She was trapped. She had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The nightmare had come for them, and there was no way out. The morning after Sarah's first terrifying encounter with the creatures, the town of Ohio was nothing like it had ever been before. The once peaceful streets, lined with homes and storefronts, were now filled with chaos. People were screaming, running, hiding, and scrambling for safety as the town's quiet charm quickly turned into a nightmare. The air was thick with the stench of death and desperation, as if the very life of the town had been drained from it. John, the local mechanic, was still reeling from the events of the previous night. He had barely slept, his mind racing with thoughts of the attack and the terror that followed. It hadn't taken long for word to spread. In the early hours of the morning, people began to flood the streets, frantic, confused, and unsure of what to do next. John had seen it himself. What started as a few scattered reports of people disappearing quickly escalated into full-blown mayhem. Houses were being torn apart, windows shattered, and the cries for help echoed down every street. John didn't have time to process it all. He grabbed his toolbox and rushed out the door, making his way to the local church, the one place he thought might provide shelter. The church, with its heavy wooden doors and tall stone walls, seemed like the only place that might hold up against the horror that had come to town. He wasn't sure why he thought the church would be safe. Maybe because it had always been a symbol of hope in the small community. But in that moment, it felt like the last stronghold of a dying world. As he approached the church, he saw others. Some of them were people he knew, neighbors, friends, and even a few strangers who had stumbled into the area for refuge. They were huddled together near the entrance, eyes wide with fear, panic written across their faces. John ran toward them, his heart pounding in his chest. "We need to get inside," he shouted, his voice hoarse. "Now." The group quickly moved toward the church, and once they were inside, the doors were slammed shut behind them. The sound of wooden barricades being hammered into place filled the air as everyone worked quickly to fortify the building. The windows were bolted up, the doors locked, and every crack in the structure was sealed. It wasn't much, but it was all they could do. Inside the church, the survivors gathered in a circle, their eyes darting nervously from one person to the next. The shock was starting to wear off, and the fear was becoming more pronounced. People were beginning to realize the gravity of the situation. They were trapped. The safety they had once known was gone, replaced by something far worse. John was one of the few who had seen the creatures up close, and he knew they weren't like anything they had ever faced before. The first clue had been how fast they were. He had expected slow, stumbling zombies, the kind of undead that had been portrayed in countless movies. But these things moved with purpose, and they moved quickly. No dragging limbs, no uncoordinated stumbling. They were fast, deliberate, and relentless. Their hunger for flesh was insatiable, and no matter how many times John or anyone else struck them down, more seemed to appear. It was as if they were multiplying by the second. "Where are they coming from?" someone asked in a trembling voice. "They're everywhere," John replied, his tone grim. "And I'm not sure how much longer we can keep them out." He looked at the barricades, feeling the weight of the words he had just spoken. The church was holding up for now, but it was clear they couldn't stay here forever. The walls of this building wouldn't keep the creatures at bay for much longer, and the longer they stayed inside, the more dangerous it became. As the hours passed, the survivors began to settle into a grim routine. Some tried to sleep, though the constant sounds of moaning and shuffling outside kept them on edge. Others spoke in hushed tones, their conversations filled with confusion and fear. There were rumors of other towns falling, of entire cities being overrun by the creatures, but no one knew for sure. All they had were whispers, and those whispers brought nothing but dread. John sat near one of the windows, his back against the wall, his thoughts racing. He had been trying to make sense of everything that was happening, but it was impossible. This wasn't just an outbreak. This wasn't a simple infection or virus. These zombies, these things, were unlike anything he had ever seen. They were smarter than they should have been, stronger, more adaptable. John's thoughts were interrupted by a loud crash. It came from the back of the church. Everyone jumped to their feet, panic spreading like wildfire. The creatures had breached the barricade. Without warning, another crash sounded, this time from the side door, followed by a chorus of deep, guttural moans. They were inside. The survivors scrambled, trying to reinforce the door and windows, but it was already too late. The creatures, at least 20 of them, pushed their way through the weakened barricades. John grabbed a crowbar and ran to the front, yelling for everyone to get to the basement. But it was chaos. People were pushing and shoving, desperate to escape. But there was no clear way out. The first of the creatures appeared in the doorway, its rotten face twisted into a grotesque grin. Its eyes were dead, its skin hanging off its bones in patches, and it moved with an unnatural speed. It lunged at the nearest survivor, tearing them apart with frightening efficiency. The sound of bone crunching under the creature's teeth was enough to send a wave of nausea through John's stomach. John swung the crowbar with all his strength, knocking the creature to the ground. But it didn't stop. It kept coming, dragging itself back to its feet, its hunger undeterred. More followed, pouring into the room like a tidal wave of death. The survivors fought back with whatever they could find. Makeshift weapons, knives, anything to try to hold them off. But it was hopeless. No matter how many they killed, more kept coming. As John fought off another attacker, he realized something that chilled him to the core. The zombies were learning. They were adapting to the barricades. They were finding ways inside, becoming more clever, more cunning with each passing moment. At first, they had been slow, but now they were almost methodical in their approach. The creatures were no longer just mindless monsters. They were evolving. John's heart sank. He didn't know how much longer they could survive. Ohio's quiet town, once full of life, was now ground zero for a horrific massacre. And it wasn't just happening here. It was spreading. The outbreak, the zombies, whatever this was only the beginning. And there was no escape. The survivors had gathered their courage, knowing full well that sitting and waiting for death wasn't an option anymore. The basement, though it had provided some safety, now felt like a tomb. The walls closed in on them as the days passed, and the silence, broken only by distant moans and the occasional crash, was maddening. There was only so much they could endure before the walls themselves seemed to be closing in. They needed to get out. They needed to fight. John had been the first to speak up. His eyes had grown hard with determination, his face gaunt from lack of sleep and constant fear. The man who had once been calm and steady in his garage was now a warrior, driven by the need to protect those who were still alive. "We can't keep hiding in here," he said, his voice steady, though his hands were shaking. "We need to take the fight to them." His words echoed in the minds of everyone in the group. It was easy to talk about fighting back, but it was another thing entirely to actually do it. The group had no real weapons, no experience with combat. What could a kitchen knife, a crowbar, or a baseball bat do against these monsters? But they had no choice. If they stayed hidden, they would die in the dark, waiting for an enemy they couldn't see. At least this way, they had a chance, however slim it might be. With whatever they could find, John and his group ventured out into the streets, their hearts pounding with the weight of what they were about to do. The air was thick, the streets eerily silent, except for the occasional shuffle of footsteps and the low guttural moans that seemed to be coming from everywhere. The smell of death was overwhelming. It clung to the air, a putrid stench that seemed to seep into their very skin. The bodies of the dead, both human and zombie, lay in heaps, discarded like garbage. Some had already begun to rot, their flesh peeling away in sickening patches, while others were barely recognizable, their eyes still wide with terror. Every corner of the street was a new horror. The once familiar neighborhood now felt like a foreign land. The houses that had been homes were now abandoned fortresses, their windows boarded up and their doors barricaded. The cars that had once lined the streets were now wrecks, abandoned in haste. The very life that had once filled these streets seemed to have evaporated overnight, leaving only an endless, haunting silence behind. As they moved cautiously down the street, the group was on high alert. They couldn't afford to make a sound, to draw attention to themselves. Every shadow felt like a threat. Every movement behind them sent chills down their spines. They had become hunters, but they were also prey. The zombies, though they were mindless creatures, seemed to have a method, a rhythm, to their attack. They weren't just wandering the streets aimlessly. No, they were hunting. They were strategizing. It was almost as if they were toying with the survivors, pushing them into corners, making them feel like there was always hope, only to snatch it away at the last moment. John's group crept forward, trying to stay in the shadows, avoiding the creatures as best as they could. But it wasn't long before they encountered their first group of zombies. They came from an alleyway, their movements slow but deliberate. Their clothes were torn, their faces twisted in grotesque expressions of hunger and rage. The smell of decay hung heavily in the air around them. They were everywhere. The group didn't have time to react. The zombies were too close. And they had no choice but to fight. John swung the crowbar with all his strength, connecting with one of the creature's skulls. The sickening crack of bone echoed in the air, and the creature fell to the ground, twitching and groaning. But it didn't stop there. Another zombie lunged at him, its rotting mouth wide open, revealing jagged teeth. John barely managed to push it back with the crowbar, but the creature kept coming, its grip strong and unrelenting. Behind him, one of the other survivors, a woman named Rachel, screamed as a zombie grabbed her from behind, its nails digging into her skin. She struggled, kicking and thrashing, but the zombie's grip only tightened. Another member of the group, Mark, lunged forward, using the baseball bat to strike the zombie in the head. The bat connected with a sickening thud, and the creature collapsed, its body twitching and convulsing on the ground. But they couldn't stop. More zombies were coming. It was like they were swarming, an endless tide of death that seemed impossible to fight off. Every time they took one down, two more appeared. The survivors were exhausted, their energy beginning to wane. It wasn't just the physical strain of fighting. It was the psychological toll, the fear, the uncertainty, the realization that they weren't just fighting for their lives anymore. They were fighting for a future that seemed increasingly impossible to reach. After what felt like hours, they finally managed to make their way back to a house, barricading the door and windows as best as they could. Their breath came in ragged gasps, their bodies covered in sweat, dirt, and blood. They had survived this time, but they knew that this was only the beginning. As the days wore on, it became clear to them that Ohio's nightmare wasn't something they could escape. The once quiet town, with its rolling hills and peaceful streets, had become a battleground. Every road was blocked. Every escape route had been closed off. The highways that once connected the town to the rest of the world were now choked with wreckage and debris. The survivors were trapped in their own homes, isolated from the world, and surrounded by the relentless onslaught of the undead. John sat in the corner of the room, his back against the wall, his hands resting on his knees. He was exhausted, physically and mentally drained. But there was no time to rest. He knew they couldn't survive in here forever. Eventually, the zombies would find a way in. They always did. And with each passing day, the group was becoming weaker. Food and water were running low. The adrenaline that had kept them going at first was wearing off, and the fear was setting in. They were starting to crack. The group had lost members. Some had been killed in the initial attack. Others had been bitten. John's gaze moved to the window, his eyes narrowing as he looked out at the empty streets. There was nothing left out there. No hope, no salvation, only endless death. Where kids used to play and neighbors waved to each other was now a graveyard. The streets were littered with the bodies of the dead, some human, some not. The survivors, those who hadn't been devoured or turned into monsters, were few, and their hope had been chipped away with every passing hour. John, who had always been the steady one, now found himself barely holding on to his sanity. He, along with a small group of others, had managed to find refuge in the town's old high school. The building, which had once been full of the chatter and laughter of students, was now a fortress. The walls that had once echoed with youthful energy now held the sounds of despair, as survivors huddled behind barricades and listened to the screams of those who had already given in to the inevitable. The high school, with its sturdy brick walls and wide hallways, seemed like the best place to hold out. But even it wasn't safe. The zombies were everywhere. No longer confined to the streets, they had found their way inside the building, clawing their way through the walls, forcing their way through windows, and pushing through anything in their path. John stood by a window, staring out at the chaos. The town, now completely overrun, looked like a war zone. The streets were crawling with the undead, their grotesque faces twisted in hunger, their eyes lifeless and vacant. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the smell of death that seemed to permeate every corner of the town. Every once in a while, a scream would cut through the silence, signaling that another person had met their end. John felt the weight of it all, pressing down on him. He was tired. The group was tired, but they had no choice. If they didn't fight back, they would become just like everyone else. Dead, or worse, one of them. The survivors had fortified the high school as best they could. Barricades of desks, chairs, and whatever else they could find were piled against the doors and windows. Every room had been turned into a makeshift safe haven, and every corner had become a place of refuge. But even with all the barricades in place, the zombies still managed to get through. They were relentless. They had learned to adapt, to find new ways in, to be faster, smarter, more determined. They were no longer mindless creatures. Now, they seemed almost purposeful, like they were hunting the living with the same intent as a predator. John's group fought valiantly, holding their ground as best they could. They used whatever weapons they could find: pipes, crowbars, baseball bats, kitchen knives, and even the occasional gun. But it wasn't enough. Each time they took down a zombie, more came, and the survivors' strength was waning. They fought for hours, moving from room to room, taking shelter when they could, striking when the opportunity arose. But as the night wore on, it became clear they were losing. The horde outside was too large. The survivors too few. The odds were stacked against them, and with each passing hour, their chances of survival grew slimmer. In the dark, cold corners of the building, the group's desperation began to show. They huddled together, trying to rest when they could, but sleep was a luxury none of them could afford. The moans of the undead outside echoed through the hallways, and every once in a while, a scream would pierce the night air as another survivor was taken. There was no escape. The high school had become a prison, and the world outside had become a nightmare. John's thoughts kept circling back to Sarah. He hadn't seen her since the first wave of attacks. He had no idea if she was still alive, if she had made it to the high school, or if she had somehow gotten trapped elsewhere. He couldn't stop thinking about her 2 kids, about the last time he'd seen her face, full of fear, but still holding on. The guilt gnawed at him. He had promised her that he would keep. And then, as the dawn of the 5th day began to break, they decided to make their final stand. The group had come to a grim realization. They couldn't stay here any longer. The zombies were closing in, and the barricades were no longer enough. They had to move, to escape, or die trying. John gathered the survivors in the gymnasium, where they had prepared a plan. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all they had. They would fight their way to the main gate, break through the horde, and head for the woods. The woods offered the only chance of escape, and even that was a slim hope. They didn't know if anyone else had made it out, but they had to try. They gathered their weapons and fortified their resolve. As John looked at the faces of the people around him, he saw the same weariness in their eyes that he felt. But there was something else there too. A flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was all they had left. They moved out into the halls of the school, creeping quietly through the darkened corridors. The zombies hadn't reached this part of the building yet, but they would. It was only a matter of time. The group pushed forward, their footsteps silent, their hearts pounding in their chests. Every sound, every creak of the floorboards made them flinch. They reached the main doors, the exit to the outside world. But as they began to push the barricade aside, they heard it. A scream. It was distant at first, but it quickly grew louder, closer. John's heart sank. He knew that scream. It was Sarah. She was still alive, but she wasn't safe. The group rushed toward the sound, their hopes rising. They broke through the doors, charging into the open. The sun had just begun to rise, casting long shadows across the street. But it didn't matter. The town had been overrun. The zombies were everywhere. And Sarah, standing... John's breath caught in his throat. She was too far away. There was no way they could reach her in time. He tried to shout her name, but the words caught in his throat. His legs moved before he could think, his body pushing forward toward the street. But the zombies were faster. They were closing in on Sarah. Their eyes locked on her, their arms reaching for her. John's heart raced as he fought through the horde, pushing and shoving his way toward her. But it was too late. Sarah screamed again. But this time, it wasn't a scream of hope. It was a scream of terror. The zombies were on her, tearing into her flesh, pulling her apart piece by piece. John reached her just as the last of her screams faded into the air, her body limp in their grasp. He was too late. They were all too late. John dropped to his knees, his hands trembling as he stared at the woman who had once been so full of life, Now, just another casualty in this nightmare. His heart shattered in that moment, the weight of his failure crashing down on him. There was no escape. There was no survival. Ohio had become their tomb, and with that, the nightmare ended. The small town of Ohio, once a symbol of quiet, unassuming American life, had been swallowed whole by an unimaginable nightmare. The world outside Ohio remained blissfully unaware of the horrors that had unfolded in the heart of the Midwest. But none of it could truly capture the devastation that had ravaged Ohio. No one outside the town could truly understand the chaos, the bloodshed, and the horror that had taken place. The world moved on, oblivious to the fact that something unspeakable had begun in the small, quiet town. But for John and the few survivors who remained, the nightmare was far from over. He stood at the edge of the town, looking back at the streets that had once been filled with life. His gaze fell on the empty houses, the abandoned cars, the ruins of a world that had been lost. Ohio, with its quaint charm and close-knit community, was now a ghost town, a battlefield where the dead roamed and the living had been wiped away. One by one, the streets were littered with the bodies of both the dead and the living, victims of the relentless Undead. John had seen so much death over the past few days, so much destruction, that he felt numb. The faces of the fallen, neighbors, friends, even strangers, flashed in his mind, each one a reminder of the nightmare that had unfolded. The wind whispered through the streets, carrying with it the faint scent of decay and rot. It tugged at John's clothes as he stood there, motionless, taking in the scene before him. His heart was heavy with grief, with loss, but there was something else in the air, a sense of finality, a feeling that this was not just the end of Ohio, but the end of something far greater. The nightmare wasn't over, not by a long shot. John turned his head slightly, and from the distance he heard them. The groans, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second. The zombies. They were still out there, wandering the streets, searching for the last remnants of life. John had thought, perhaps naively, that once the last of the survivors had been wiped out, the undead would simply fade away, left to rot in the ruins of the town. But he was wrong. The hunger for flesh was endless. And no matter how many died, there were always more that would rise from the depths of death to feast again. It was an unending cycle, a nightmare that refused to die. John had learned that the hard way. He had been through hell and back. He had fought tooth and nail to survive. But now he was standing in the aftermath of it all. A hollow shell of the man he had once been. The world outside Ohio was oblivious, going on with its business. unaware that one of the most horrific tragedies in modern history had unfolded in this small, unassuming town. There were no heroes, no armies marching in to save them, no government intervention. The town had been left to burn, and now it was nothing more than a hollow reminder of what had once been. John was one of the last survivors. He had watched as his friends, his family, and everyone he had known was either consumed by the undead or turned into one of them. He had fought alongside them, and when the last of them had fallen, he had been left alone. It was a cruel irony. The very thing that had kept him going, the hope of finding others, had been his undoing. Now, standing on the outskirts of what was left of Ohio, he realized that there was nothing left. No hope. No future. Just an endless nightmare. He could feel it gnawing at him, a deep ache in his chest, the weight of everything he had lost, the guilt, the anger, the sorrow. They all mixed together in a twisted cocktail of despair. But there was something else there too, something darker, a sense of emptiness. He had no one left, no one to fight for, no reason to keep going. But still, he had survived. He didn't know why, he didn't know how, but here he was, the last man standing, surrounded by the echoes of a world that had long since died. John took a deep breath, the cold air biting at his lungs. He could hear the groans of the zombies growing closer now, their footsteps shuffling in the distance. They were still out there, wandering aimlessly, searching for anything to satisfy their insatiable hunger. It was a chilling thought. These creatures, these once human beings, had no purpose anymore, no reason to exist other than to consume. And yet, they kept coming, relentless, unstoppable. As John turned to leave, his footsteps slow and heavy, he couldn't shake the feeling that the nightmare wasn't just confined to Ohio. It was everywhere. The infection, the undead, it was spreading, reaching out to claim more and more. Ohio had been ground zero, but the world was next. He didn't know how long it would take, but he knew that eventually the rest of the world would fall. The news would report more outbreaks, more disappearances, more unexplained deaths. And then, one day, they would all come to understand that the world had been consumed by the same hunger that had destroyed Ohio. As John walked away from the wreckage of the town, he found himself asking a question he couldn't answer. Could they ever truly escape this nightmare? Was there any hope left? Or was this just the beginning of an endless, unstoppable wave of death that would wipe out everything in its path? John had no answers. He only had the knowledge that the nightmare was far from over. It would continue, growing, spreading, infecting the world. And in the end, the question would no longer be whether they could escape. it would be whether humanity could ever rise again from the ashes of the world they had lost. For now, John walked in silence, the distant groans of the undead echoing in his ears, the weight of the world heavy on his shoulders. There was no escape. There was no end. Ohio's nightmare was just one chapter in a story that would never be finished.